Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Lauren Barrett, and joining me as well is JT Jaeger, our viticulture specialist. And today we're going to be talking about compromised fruit, specifically with Botrytis bunch rot and powdery mildew. Just a few formalities before we get started with the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be published on the Enartis website. Please refrain from using the chat box during the presentation. We have allotted 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions, so just hold off until then. And then if you're having any technical difficulties, please use chat box 2, and Whitney will be there to help you. So just to kind of give you an overview of the presentation, we're going to begin the first half of the presentation with JT talking about monitoring tools for powdery mildew and botrytis bunch rot. And then after, I will start talking about acceptance levels, control points, wine matrix alterations connected with both powdery mildew and botrytis. So with that being said, I will go ahead and let JT get started with an introduction to botrytis and powdery mildew.
Hello everyone, again my name is JT Jaeger and I'm the Viticulture Specialist at Enartis USA. So briefly introduce the agenda for the presentation. So I'll first introduce the two grapevine diseases, looking at their life cycles and typical symptoms in the vineyard. Then we'll move into explaining disease risk at any given time of the year. Then also explaining what conditions we have seen this year and briefly discuss implications for later on in the year. And I'll wrap it up by mentioning certain management techniques and discussing if there are any complications, if any at all, that these might create for the winemaking process. So just to get into it, I'll start off with botrytis. So it is found in all major grape producing regions in the world and is actually the dominant fungus found in harvested grapes, harvested wine grapes. So really no matter what state in the US or wine growing country you farm grapes in, you're likely to find the disease. It can be a sought-after fungus in certain styles of wine known as noble rot, but in most wine styles it is something you want to minimize because it can impart a moldy character in wines if found in high enough quantities. In worst cases, yield can be reduced by over half, which can also be attributed in part to secondary infections that will reduce yields even further. Botrytis infections can also weaken the vine itself, which allows for other organisms to take advantage of the vine's weakened state. So briefly, just going through the life cycle here, botrytis will infect the young succulent shoot growth early in the season with moisture, free moisture, causing soft brown rot at any position on the shoot stem. If rains occur during bloom, the fungus can cause a latent infection of the grape flower and remain dormant until mid-season, where it resumes growth, causing rotting of the berries without further damage or further rain. This is also known as early botrytis rot. If berries are damaged by pests or from farming equipment as fruit is maturing, fungal growth can move from the split skins of infected berries to consume the whole bunches. It's also important to note that botrytis is very good at colonizing dead or senescent tissues and can overwinter in mummified berries, and these are what we call mummies, where it lies dormant until ideal spring conditions can lead to the next season's infections. So briefly going through the symptoms of the infection. So damage can occur on shoot or vegetation, causing necroses, but it is most damaging on ripening grapes, resulting in reductions in fruit quality and loss of fruit weight really. The infection manifests as brown or reddish colored and shriveled berries. In extreme cases can cause this fuzzy gray-brown mass to be seen on the fruit. Again, it can appear as a single berry exhibiting symptoms, but under favorable weather conditions, the disease can spread throughout the whole cluster. So when are we at most risk for botrytis? So really high relative humidity and mild to moderate temperatures results in sort of persistent moisture on berry surfaces and promotes infection and disease development. If moisture persists for greater than 15 hours, even without ideal temperatures, this can be considered a severe infection event. This is really only because it takes 2 to 4 hours for spores to germinate, and this is at optimal temperatures between 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit with free moisture. It's also really important to note the fungus cannot really grow above 90 degrees Fahrenheit and begins to die after 12 hours of exposure to sustain temperatures above this threshold. So just to sort of look at current conditions this year for a section of time, and then maybe predicting what the rest of the season might look like. So I exported and graphed public data for Sonoma County, which is where the Enartis office is based out of. Charted it for leaf wetness in hours at the top graph. On the bottom left is daily maximum temperatures. Bottom right is relative humidity, and I did this for 4 separate AVAs around the area. The top graph, leaf wetness, is essentially just a measurement used to monitor the level of surface moisture on the foliage and berries, and is critical to calculate botrytis pressures during the season. An example of worst case scenario here, you can see for some growers this year, wet conditions occurred in May. It was actually a rain event, and a lot of vineyards were in bloom, and temperatures were between the 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit window. And so if you have similar conditions during pre-harvest or at harvest, botrytis pressures can be similarly high. You can see best case scenario here. You see the leaf wetness hours drops off to 0. And this is where temperatures were actually sustained above this 49 degrees Fahrenheit for an extended period of time, and it was generally dry conditions. You can see the relative humidity drops off as well. So what are high-risk vineyards? So it might be obvious, but previously infected vineyards where the fungus can overwinter in the poorly lignified canes and grape mummies are at high risk. Sheltered areas such as hollows are also at greatest risk of developing disease. Basically areas with low wind and milder temperatures where moisture can persist. You get the same effect in vineyards with vigorous and dense canopies, and this is just for the same reason. You get restricted airflow to the fruiting zone. There are also varietals known for having compact clusters, essentially minimal space between the berries that traps the moisture, and thin skin, which also increases that risk. And I also included a list of some susceptible varietals. Highly resistant varietals include Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah, but no wine grape varietals are immune to botrytis, even ones that are considered highly resistant. So disease management. So canopy management is kind of the name of the game. Leaf removal opens up the canopy and encourages airflow, which dries the fruiting zone out. Although opening the canopy up too much can expose the fruit to the elements for higher temperatures later in the year, which actually can cause sunburn and shrivel in extreme conditions. At hand harvesting, you can come through and selectively harvest the infected fruit. In case of partial infection of a cluster, the infected portion of the cluster can be cut out and discarded at harvest by vineyard crews. For machine harvesting, hand pickers can come through, remove the worst of the fruit, and the machines can come in and harvest afterwards. And then there's the fungicides. So I'm not really going to get into the individual fungicides here, but there are many commonly used inorganic and organic fungicides that are used globally, some of which include heavy metals, such as copper, and Lauren will go into the implications of that. And also it's important to note it's best to rotate these fungicides with different modes of action, which reduces the risk of fungicide resistance. So final thoughts on botrytis. Botrytis can and will cause direct crop loss as infected fruit is discarded by vineyard crews, and also through berry shrivel. Botrytis will produce an enzyme that can cause complications in the winemaking process, which Lauren will also get into further. It can also cause secondary infections, and these secondary infections can induce further wine taints and accrue increased yield losses as well. Because of the risk of botrytis with late season rain events, premature harvest decisions will be made ahead of these rains, and you can sacrifice certain quality parameters that you're aiming for. And then another obvious effect is that you can have increased economic costs resulting from the need of sorting and disposal of damaged bunches. So just now to move into powdery mildew. So why should we care? Although native to North America, it's globally the most widespread and destructive disease in grapevines, as well as all other agriculturally important crops. Powdery mildew can reduce the rates of photosynthesis and in turn carbohydrate storage, which slows ripening of grapes and in extreme cases can even stop the ripening of grapes. Vineyards can even have a distinct mushroom-like aroma at high incidence levels. The powdery mildew infection will cause the cracking of berries, which leaves them susceptible to bunch rots like botrytis. So oftentimes when you get an extreme infection of powdery mildew, botrytis is not far behind. It's also important to note that a common tool to kill the fungus is, or more a preventative measure, is elemental sulfur, which can have implications with residues as fruit comes into the winery. And I just included this note at the bottom. Powdery mildew is not to be confused with downy mildew, which is actually a big problem on the East Coast and in Europe, where summer rains are more common. So just get into the life cycle. So ascospores will overwinter in these woody parts of the vine. And in the springtime, when you get rain events, free moisture is needed to release these ascospores. And it can actually be high humidity or rain, so coastal regions that get heavy fog as well. The secondary spread of the mitospores does not require free moisture. So only early season do you need this free moisture. The rest of the year, the mitospores of the powdery mildew can only germinate on dry leaves and plant tissue, which is why powdery mildew is often called the fair weather fungus. Once the infection becomes severe enough, it will then spread from these leaves to the clusters themselves. So now, really to move into the symptoms of the infection, powdery mildew will first appear as chlorotic spots in the leaves, and actually, if you can only really see them if you hold it up to the light, and you'll see these little spots. This then turns into the classic symptom that gives the disease its name, the white powdery masses that colonize pretty much any live tissue on the vine. When damage is severe enough, it can be seen as this brownish black web scarring on fruit and the woody parts of the vine. So disease risk. So again, after initial ascospore germination, powdery mildew does not actually like getting wet. So simply just spraying water on the infected areas can damage the fungus. The ideal temperature range for growth of the fungus is between 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. But high temperatures greater than 95 degrees, unlike botrytis, powdery mildew it's not actually killed by high temperatures. It only slows its growth. UV light, on the other hand, can kill the fungus, and that's why leaf removal can be effective at stopping spread of infection. I have the statistic here that one spore of powdery mildew can multiply to 50 million spores in just 3 weeks. And this is actually why control and prevention of the disease is super important, because it can reproduce and infect so quickly. So before I move into the next slide of current conditions, I kind of want to introduce the powdery mildew index. So grape growers will use this to determine infection risk and calculate spray intervals during the season of various fungicides. On the very far left, you'll see indices of between 0 to 30 is low disease pressure, so low risk. 40 to 50 is moderate pressure, and 60 or above is high pressure. So depending on the indices, you can get an idea of how frequently to spray common fungicides. So for a powdery mildew index of, say, 75, you would spray sulfur, for example, on an every 7-day interval. So now with that in mind, I again pulled data for Sonoma County and plotted it in charts. And you can see powdery mildew index on the top graph, daily maximum temperatures again on the left, and relative humidity on the right. So worst case scenario here, for mid-season to harvest, the powdery mildew index is high for most regions and sustained for over a month. This is because really we have this mild to moderate temperature range, essentially 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the weather conditions are relatively dry. You can see here that hot weather can actually slow the growth of the fungus, but the disease pressure recovers fairly quickly as temperatures cool. And then again, opposite to botrytis, the best case scenario is when wet and rainy weather, which causes the indices to drop off entirely. So what are high-risk vineyards? So again, previously infected vineyards, you had infection last year, you're more at risk the following year, because the fungus can overwinter in these woody parts of the vine. Areas downwind of infected vineyards, so spores can blow in the wind and into your vineyard and infect your vines. Your neighbor's not so great farming habits can actually affect the success of your vintage if you're not vigilant. Sheltered areas of a vineyard and shaded parts of the canopy are conditions that suit initiation and development of the disease. And I include another list of the susceptible varietals. And you can kind of see that this list is quite different from powdery mildew. For example, Cabernet Sauvignon, which is resistant to botrytis, is actually highly susceptible to powdery mildew. So disease management, very briefly. In the early season, again with this ascospore release, and we say early season, we mean essentially dormancy to bud break. It's important to control the cover crop, as the overgrown cover crop can increase relative humidity in the vineyard canopy, which increases the incidence and severity of the powdery mildew, that ascospore release. This is where lime sulfur or oil can be used to suppress the initial ascospore release. From mid-season to harvest, fungicide applications are applied at various intervals depending on disease pressure as sort of a preventative measure. Sulfur is actually most common because it is cheap and can be used organically or inorganically, and actually has no risk for resistance development like other fungicides might have. And actually even some growers will include sulfur in the tank mix to help resistance management. And then again, canopy management is the name of the game. Leaf removal is often used to open up the canopy where it's too dense, let light in, and then actually allow for a better coverage of fungicide sprays. So final thoughts on powdery mildew. Severe infection of powdery mildew can and will decrease crop production for several years. This is even without further infection in the following years. Diseased berries can cause off flavors in the wine. Lauren will get more into this. Splitting of infected berries increases the susceptibility to bunch rots, such as botrytis, so oftentimes you get a severe infection of powdery mildew in the vineyard, and botrytis is not far behind. And this is also something to consider here. Frequent and long season use, or season-long usage rather, of sulfur can cause significant amounts of residues on the clusters, which has implications for the winemaking process. So areas that are high risk for long periods of time before harvest will likely have more residues at the time of harvest. I've included some links here. The UC IPM Grape Pest Management Guidelines are an important resource for for all grapevine pests and diseases. There's a few other links here as well. Public data for weather. And then I'm going to hand it off to Lauren. She's going to get into the winemaking implications.
So thank you, JT, and I'm going to be getting into acceptance levels control points, and wine matrix alterations that occur with Botrytis sponge rot and powdery mildew. So acceptance levels, how much is too much? It's very important for producers to establish and implement quality control measures for defining critical limits related to various quality factors in the winemaking process. And the assessment of disease incidence is one of those very critical factors that needs to be accounted for. So there's some various methods for assessing and defining disease incidence and severity. Just to give you a couple definitions, so incidence is the number of plant parts which are infected out of a sample, while severity is the intensity of the disease infecting each individual part. So botrytis severity can be defined as botrytis crop loss or the percentage of crop infection. Majority of producers are using visual assessment tools, and this bunch rot assessment trainer is a online program to where you can help calibrate and improve your assessor accuracy in assessing botrytis incidence. So actually train a specialist to be on the sorting table, evaluating the percentage of crop infection and making sure to log that accordingly with your quality control program that you have implemented. Other assessment methods include image analysis, quantitative PCR, and some spectrographic techniques. In research, ergosterol, lacase, and various immunology assays are also practiced as well. Here at Vincere Labs for both botrytis, sponge rot, and powdery, we offer volatile acidity analysis, glycerol, which is an indicator of botrytis at high quantities, filterability panel assessing how filterable a wine can be, and then we offer a complete botrytis panel, which includes gluconic acid measurements and a PCR for the number of spores present within a sample, with a low risk being 100 spores per mil, medium risk 100 to 500 spores per mil, and high risk above 500 spores per milliliter. Other important analysis techniques are also colorimetric analysis, especially for assessing the detriment caused by the oxidative enzyme lacase, which I will get into next. So grapevine disease alterations to must. I'm first just going to get started with botrytis, and as JT mentioned, it is one of the most detrimental grapevine diseases throughout the world. And botrytis, one of the most detrimental contributions that it has to wine must is a oxidative enzyme called lacase, which is a non-specific oxidative enzyme which affects diphenols and aromatic amines. Botrytis also excretes extracellular glucans and C5 polyols and mannitol, which can affect filterability. There's biogenic amine and mycotoxin accumulation in must affected with botrytis, a depletion of nitrogen and amino acids, specifically organic nitrogen, a production of moldy and earthy off flavors, specifically 1-octanthreol, which is this mushroom aroma, and then there is also a geranium-like taint associated with botrytis as well, which is like geranium leaf. Botrytis oxidizes and depletes organic acids. It opens the doors for secondary infections as well. And there often is a depletion of free SO2 and excessive use of SO2 with botrytis fruit. So some of the wine matrix alterations, of course, you have the contribution from all of these secondary metabolites, which we just reviewed, glucans, biogenic amines, and then sensory modification. But I really wanted to focus on lacase because unlike other oxidative enzymes, it is resistant to SO2, is very tolerant to wine conditions, and is a very fast detrimental enzyme on wine quality, color, and aromatics. So if anyone has flash détente or thermovinification units, it is heat sensitive. It's also copper dependent, so using chelators can be helpful, removing residual copper that could be present from copper sulfate sprays. And then bentonite fighting can help reduce its activity as well. So lacase, it directly oxidizes diphenols, and from there it can oxidize a wide spectrum of polyphenols, and it causes a cascade of catalyzed oxidation in that it's quite unique enzyme in that it can oxidize small molecules that in turn oxidize other compounds that wouldn't normally be a substrate for lacase. So there's this oxidative cascade with lacase, and these other compounds are called mediator compounds. So it's important to keep that in mind when controlling lacase. This graph here is from the Australian Society of Viticulture and Enology, and what you can see is the total phenol content, total tannin, and total anthocyanin in healthy seeds, infected seeds, healthy skins, and infected skins. And what we can see is that in all incidences of the infected seeds and skins, there was a dramatic loss in phenolic content. So different techniques for inhibiting lacase in must. Sulfur dioxide is a tool which can be applied, but as you can see, according to this graph, it requires very high quantities of sulfur dioxide. And here we have a curve showing the activity of lacase and time with different heat treatments. And at 2 minutes at 80 degrees C was completely able to reduce the activity of lacase. So any sort of um, thermovinification or heat treatment to must would be a good option for must infected with botrytis. So here we have a graph, and this is looking at the application of enological tannins on reducing enzyme or lacase enzyme activity. So this paper, it was from Bordeaux, and it's looking at various enological tannins, and we can see here gallotannin, elagitannin, grapeseed tannin, grape skin tannin, and then quercus tannin as well. And in this specific study, all of the tannins were able to lower the activity of lacase, specifically grapeseed-derived tannin, which is composed of a high concentration of gallic tannin. So Enartis, we have a product called Enartis Tan Antibotrytis, and it is a combination blend of gallic tannin, elagic tannin, and condensed tannins. And at 20 grams per hectoliter can reduce the activity of lacase by up to 60%. So used in combination with SO2, this is a good alternative for inhibiting lacase if you do not have the specialized equipment required for thermal treatments. So along with lacase, botrytis also contributes other detrimental effects in must. There is microbial inhibition and competition, specifically with a compound that is similar to yeast killer toxins. It's called botrytis. There is a nutrient depletion in must infected with botrytis, specifically of thiamine, which is a very important vitamin for yeast health and an important survival factor. And there is quite a significant effect on the acid composition of must. So botrytis can consume up to 70 to 90% of the tartaric acid, 70% of the malic acid, and this causes an increase in pH and a decrease in TA, which of course affects the activity of sulfur, and higher pHs also open the door for other sorts of microbial spoilage. Here on the right-hand side, I have a graph which was pulled from Dr. Harold Kloss from Germany, and it also lists some of the increasing and decreasing factors seen with botrytis-infected must and wine. So to get into some of the secondary infections associated with Botrytis sponge rot, so as this disease ruptures berries and carbohydrate sources are revealed in the vineyard, many opportunistic organisms take advantage of this carbohydrate source. So you will see associated with Botrytis sponge rot a lot of sour rot, which includes a consortium of different bacteria, Gluconobacter, acetic acid bacteria, and there's also some non-Saccharomyces yeast and other sorts of molds which can take advantage of these skin ruptures. Insects are really the main vectors for transporting yeast and bacteria, and specifically Drosophila, or fruit flies. So that's an important factor to manage, especially in the winery, as these organisms can spread and proliferate other spoilage microorganisms. So just to start talking through some control points for botrytis infected fruit. So vineyard management and selective sorting is one of the key crucial parts for controlling botrytis, and you do not want to ever mix infected fruit with healthy fruit. In the vineyard, if you are machine harvesting, we recommend using a effervescent SO2 directly into the gondolas to help limit the activity of lacase because it has very fast kinetics. It's important to start antioxidant production in the vineyard. And again, just really trying to reiterate oxidation and antimicrobial control. So we have ascorbic acid, hydrolyzable tannins, ketosane, and sulfur dioxide, which are our main tools for doing so. And combining the effects of all of these will help mitigate the excessive use of sulfur dioxide. So for white wines too, it's very important to separate out the press fractions and also increase the settling velocity for white wines and clarification. And for red wines, you're going to want to minimize maceration and remove any extended maceration practices. So some of the fermentation problems that can arise from the nutrient depletion associated with botrytis and secondary infections is amino acids are the most affected nitrogen source. So there could be a loss of up to 60% of amino organic nitrogen. So it's very important to supplement with amino acids as these are very critical survival factors for yeast. And due to the berry shrivel and dehydration process associated with botrytis, there is an increase in sugar, which can increase osmotic stress for yeast too. So this is important to manage at reception. And you can utilize different fining techniques like cellulose or yeast holes to help remove some of these toxins that are associated with botrytis. And filterability associated with both powdery mildew and botrytis. So botrytis, it produces a lot of these large molecular weight polymers called glucans, and they can cause extreme filter fouling and filterability issues. So it's important to apply commercial glucanases to help chop up these long chains to increase wine's filterability. What we recommend is a pre-fermentation addition of a glucanase and then testing for glucans after alcoholic fermentation to assess if the presence or non-presence of glucans. This is one of the most requested and the most calls that we get at Enartis Wine Services is related to filterability. And my first question for winemakers is always, have you tested the wine for glucans? So it's important to apply some proactive remediation techniques, especially if you are receiving microbially infected fruit. So now just to get into a few notes on powdery mildew. So at about 9% contamination, you will see a decrease in wine quality. Again, like botrytis, there's elevated mycotoxins and biogenic amines. There's similar moldy off flavors which are formed from powdery mildew. Um, Almost 1-octanthreone, which is that mushroom aroma, and then 1,5-octandithreone is a geranium leaf-like aroma. Luckily, Saccharomyces enzyme activity can usually help reduce these off flavors, and they will blow off during alcoholic fermentation. But this is an important factor in yeast selection when dealing with high incidence of powdery mildew. There's nutrient and vitamin depletion. There's very high protein instability, and this is related to pathogentic related proteins, PR proteins, which can really increase the level of bentonite fining and protein stabilization techniques that need to be applied. There's a lot higher level of potassium in powdery mildew infected musts, and this increases the pH of wines. Associated with the detriment of transpiration with the grapevine, there is a higher level of unripe phenolic content. Actually, one of the only positives with powdery mildew is an increase in resveratrol as well with these wines, and that's an immune response from the grapevine. But a lot of these phenolic compounds can lead to underripe green characteristics. So, and this can subsequently lead to wines that are lacking mid-palate volume and balance. So with both powdery mildew and botrytis, as JT was talking about the late applications of fungicides in the vineyard, there is a lot of residues that you should expect to find on this infected fruit. Specifically in organic vineyards, you can see elevated levels of copper sulfate and elemental sulfur. Here at Enartis, we have some specific fining agents which have a high affinity for copper, and these are very important for removing copper as it's a catalyst in oxidation reactions in wine. So this fining agent is called PVI-PVP, and it can be applied in wine and juice, and it absorbs heavy metals and can help remove hydroxycinamic acids and low molecular weight catechins, which participate in these browning reactions. So just to touch on some of the remediation techniques that we offer, or that we recommend, in the supporting documents, just below here at the folder on your right-hand side of the screen, we have protocols for dealing with white, rosé, and red wines infected with botrytis and powdery mildew. I highly recommend that you click on that and download all that content in there, as well as a copy of this presentation, just so you have it in your records. I'm going to just touch on some of the main remediation techniques and considerations, but I highly recommend you to take the time to look through those protocols and be prepared in case of disease incidents this vintage. So for powdery mildew remediation in red and white wines and rosé wines, again, hand harvesting and sorting is a very critical factor here. Utilizing antioxidants and microbial stabilization is critical as well. For red wines, you're going to want to limit skin contact, and for white wines, you're going to want to whole cluster press and do fast settling and clarification. One of the more common instabilities associated in red wines with powdery mildew is color instability. So it's very important to utilize tannins to promote stable color condensation and copigmentation reactions. Selecting a yeast strain with high aromatic potential and enzyme activity will help reduce some of those off flavors associated with powdery mildew. And it's very important to, of course, supplement organic nitrogen in these musts, as organic nitrogen can be dramatically decreased. And again, there is finishing tools available for attenuating mouthfeel and adding more structure in these wines. So for Botrytis winemaking remediation, I have it broken up into two sections. This one is specifically with white wine. So in the vineyard, again, if fruit is mechanically harvested, we highly recommend using a effervescent sulfur dioxide directly in the gondolas at the vineyard itself. You really need to be proactive with antioxidant protection and limiting the activity of lacase. So for white wine, you want to whole cluster press similar to powdery mildew, and separate the first 10 gallons per ton of that press wine, just because it's full of mold metabolites, and it should be completely separated and is usually discarded. With each individual press fraction, browning should also be assessed. Sulfur dioxide should, of course, be used, and then cold clarification and settling with bentonite will help expedite the settling. Controlling the pH and acidulating is very critical to increase the efficiency of SO2. And if there is any sort of browning that is happening, allowing polymerization and the precipitation of these oxidized phenols is important. And then there's many sorts of phenolic finding tools like gelatin, cellulose, and PVPP, which can be utilized to remove these browning pigments. Now for red wine, this is a little bit more tricky. Um, you want to apply short vatting, so limit your maceration time. You cannot practice extended maceration with botrytis infected fruit. You're going to want to adjust your pH, of course, and then microbial control utilizing a combination of sulfur dioxide and ketozan is critical for limiting the activity of lacase, and which can cause subsequent browning. And then also, if you have any sort of heat exchanger or flash detant unit, this is a massive tool for completely eliminating lacase. If there is browning present, you can use various phenolic finding agents like Clairol SP to get rid of those browning products and quinones, but only if it's visual, as this will have an effect on coloring material. And again, I have to stress the use of glucanases to help break out any residual glucans which can be present, which will cause a massive headache for filtering later on. Well, that does it. And what we have, again, just to reiterate, we have a lot more detailed protocols and information in the supporting documents available for download. We're going to start to get into the questions, but before I do that, I just wanted to see if anyone who's listening has had any historical experience with any of these diseases mentioned. And we are looking to collaborate with producers, specifically if there's anyone from the East Coast who's listening, on working on some harvest trials for the upcoming vintage. So if you're interested at all in that, please feel free to email myself or JT, and we'd love to collaborate and try to learn more about this issue. But let's go ahead and get started with some questions. So I will open up the chat box to questions now, and JT is here with me, so we will take turns answering questions. Please just make sure that you preface who you have a question for. If everyone could just try to use the first chat box for questions. I just saw that there's a question um, in chat box 2, which is more for technical difficulties, but Yvonne is asking, does potassium bicarbonate kill powdery mildew? I'm going to go ahead and ask JT if he's familiar with this, as it's more of a vineyard application, I imagine.
I've actually don't have much experience with using potassium bicarbonate to kill powdery mildew. That's definitely something that I can look into and get back to you on, Ivan.
Okay, so it looks like we have a few more questions coming in. So Whitney, there's Lauren and JT here. Whitney is our kind of technical support with the webinar platform, but can you talk about timing for tannin addition, bentonite on infected juices? Yes, it's very important to actually start to apply antioxidants like tannins early on, even during reception and at the crusher. And having a combination of tannins and SO2, ascorbic acid in the incidence with botrytis is very critical. And if you take a look at some of the protocols, you'll see that at least with our philosophy is usually adding tannins at grape reception and then halfway through fermentation for red wines to help with color stabilization as well. And we also utilize to help with color stabilization as well. And we also recommend utilizing some combination products, so tannins and manoproteins and yeast derivatives to help stabilize color and also contribute to stabilizing protein stability and colloid stability. But definitely check out the protocols because we have some very detailed steps for when to apply bentonites, tannins, and various control agents. Okay, so this question is for JT, and it says, what are you getting in field reports for powdery mildew in 2019? We are seeing it.
Yeah, I'm actually seeing quite a bit of it as well. A lot of growers this year, especially, we experienced on the West Coast a really wet springtime, and as you remember from my part of the presentation, powdery mildew, that initial release of the ascospores requires that free moisture and high relative humidity. So if you weren't up on your preventative measures and aren't up on your fungicide sprays, or even still, if those ascospores were able to release, you're going to see a high incidence of the disease itself this year.
All right, and the next question from David D. How long does Stab Micro M take to settle before ML? Do you recommend any finding tools for settling Stab Micro M before ML? Well, what I would first say is that applying Stab Micro M to must is very important. It doesn't necessarily affect Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but it will affect various non-Saccharomyces and bacteria. I recommend, though not, you can leave it in during the juice phase, but I would, once alcoholic is finished, try to immediately settle and rack it before ML. Some people also apply it mainly for white wines if I'm doing clarification and juice settling. They will go ahead and suspend it during in the juice phase before settling to remove any microorganisms before applying it or before racking off and starting fermentation. I hope that answers your question, but please feel free to email me directly if you have any more specific questions, especially with Stab Micro. Hopefully you guys all heard me on that. Sorry for the sound drop off, but okay. And then again, just to touch again on the Stab Micro, if you want to increase settling, you could use other counter finding agents like silica, and that will typically increase the efficiency in settling of many different finding agents. So it looks like we have a couple questions for JT coming up here. So Yvonne or Ivan is asking, what kills powdery mildew?
That's a good question. A lot of the fungicides like sulfur are more preventative measures. So if you've got an extreme infection in your vineyard, sulfur won't actually kill powdery mildew. So sulfur is more preventative. There are many fungicides that you might use. Early season oils and lime sulfur can actually prevent that initial spread of powdery mildew. And again, that's more of a preventative measure. There are fungicides on the list of fungicides, and I can actually attach that to the supplemental information as well that can kill powdery mildew.
Yeah, definitely check out some of his citation pages too for integrated pest management through the UC Davis extension. It's a great resource as well. So let me see here. Andrea B is asking for JT. I have heard mixed results on the efficiency of a dormant lime sulfur spray on mitigating powdery mildew. Can you comment on this or other options?
I think it really comes, I've actually heard mixed reviews on this as well, and I really think it comes down to timing of the application. You really have to time it when that initial ascospore release is going to occur. If you apply it after that happens, then it's not going to be efficient because those spores have already been released. So really the time of application, looking at your early season indices, looking at temperatures, relative humidity initially in that season really can be important for the timing of that application.
And it looks like Stephen B is saying that he uses sodium bicarbonate to kill any signs of powdery mildew in the vineyard, so that could potentially be an option as well. But I guess we'll leave the chat box open for another few minutes for any last minute questions. But thank you all for participating and asking such good questions. All right, well, it looks like we're having some people leave the webinar, and it seems like we have answered all of the questions. Again, for anybody who's interested in 2019 harvest trials, especially if you've experienced historic problems with botrytis or powdery mildew, please feel free to directly email myself for more information about participating in some of these protocols and trials. And again, if anyone has any vineyard-related questions, JT's email and contact is listed above. Please feel comfortable reaching out to us with anything. We are here to help you all and learn from you all as well. So take care, and fingers crossed that we have a good season this upcoming vintage. Thank you, everyone.